All right, once again, hello, and welcome to Module 3, which will be a brief synoptic survey of human and economic global geographies. So it is a little bit crazy to try to cover all of human geography in just 1 week. So it's important that you understand that, of course, human geography includes a huge wealth of studies and knowledge, and in 1 week, the best we can do is an introductory summary. So we're getting just a very surface level view to some of the biggest concepts. If you're thinking to yourself as you're listening to this lecture and reading the book, if you're thinking to yourself, oh man, it must get a lot more complicated than this, then you are correct, and we'll be able to delve into some more of those complexities over the course of the semester as we zoom in on each particular region. Even then, there will be a lot more to the story that we're not covering that I encourage you to take part in even more advanced classes for what interests you. But anyhow, we have to start somewhere, and this week that means here. So last week we focused on physical geography, the Earth system and the interactions of humans with the Earth system. And this week we're focusing more on human society, human development. So first, let's talk about these key concepts and themes. So these are probably terms you've heard before, but that you may not have delved into very deeply. So these include things like GDP, development and development theory, the uneven nature of development, the major historical periods of global geography, capitalism, colonialism, HDI, the Human Development Index, major theories of development, globalization, and a quick thought about the advantages and disadvantages of globalization. So this is what we'll be covering in today's lecture. And again, each of these concepts could merit an entire lecture, or frankly, an entire module or course of its own, but we'll start just with this introduction. So first, here's a map showing global GDP in 2012. GDP per capita. GDP, of course, meaning gross domestic product, and per capita meaning per person. So in other words, you take the economy, you divide by the number of people, and this is the measurement that we come up with. So as you can see, the countries in blue are the highest earning countries in terms of GDP per capita, the wealthiest countries. So you'll see, of course, that includes us here in the United States, Western Europe, Australia. And if you look at the lowest earning countries, you'll see that these are largely concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So this gives us a basic visual overview of the richest and poorest countries in the world measured in terms of GDP. Now there's another interesting way of visualizing this, and that's with a GDP per capita cartogram, which distorts the size of a country based on the GDP per capita. So in other words, the outlines, the borders of the country are maintained, but the size is changed based on GDP. So of course you'll recognize us here in the United States, quite large. Western Europe, also quite large. You might be thinking, what's this purple blob over here? I haven't seen anything like that on a map. That would be Japan, which of course is relatively wealthy. Now nearly disappearing from the map are South America, and you can kind of see North Africa here, but Sub-Saharan Africa is extremely thin, because remember from this last map, GDP per capita there is extremely low. Now, GDP per capita only captures a certain aspect of the division of wealth between and within countries. So, first of all, it's a matter of wealth distribution. The GDP per capita is an average. This doesn't talk about inequality within a country. So even in some very wealthy countries, there are, of course, still some very, very poor people and some very, very rich people. And there's a more complicated way of measuring inequality called the Gini index, which I encourage you to look into. Second of all, GDP only measures the formal economy, what's being formally tracked by governments, by agencies, and of course there's a lot of informal, non-taxed aspects to the economy, especially outside of more developed countries, but even places like the United States, where, for instance, a large example of the informal economy might be something like drug trafficking, or closer to home, something like babysitting, unless you're reporting that as income. It also ignores all other aspects of development besides economic activity. And later on, we'll talk about other ways of measuring development, including the Human Development Index and a few other measurements that have been proposed, but that are not captured by gross domestic product. And finally, you've probably heard the phrase purchasing power parity. So there's another measure of GDP that factors in purchasing power parity, which is to say that the purchasing power of currency is different depending where you go in the world. So when they're doing the purchasing power parity calculations, they try to take into account local costs using what's called a certain basket of goods. So imagine saying, okay, what does it cost to rent an apartment, buy food, buy education, buy healthcare in one country or another? They compare those things and then they adjust GDP to show what you can actually get for currency in different countries. So it's a useful measurement for looking at the broad strokes of the distribution of wealth in the world, but it's important to bear in mind that it does have limitations. All right, let's turn to the definition of development. So for a definition from our textbook, development is the improvement in the economic well-being and standard of living of people. It's an economic, a social, and a political project. And a quick definition of development theory from our textbook, which, by the way, by the time you're listening to this lecture, you should have already read the pertinent parts of the textbook. So if you're hearing my voice and you haven't looked at the textbook yet, please pause the video, set me aside, pick up the textbook, take a look, and then come back once you've read. But according to the textbook, the definition of development theory is an analysis of social change that assesses the economic progress of individual countries in an evolutionary way. And a little bit later in the lecture, I'll introduce some major development theories, and we'll parse this definition a little bit. All right, let's think about the state of economic development, technology, and social well-being throughout the world. Now, I would probably be stating the obvious, or at least I hope I'm stating the obvious, when I say that these things are distributed unevenly throughout the world. And some of this has to do with luck, and a lot of this has to do with history and political and economic processes. Now, to start with, there's an uneven global distribution of natural resources and energy sources. So, for instance, the United States is rich in farmland. We have a lot of arable land, and we're growing a lot of stuff on it. The Sahara is very rich in solar energy. Now, for the time being, nobody has figured out how to exploit that for a lot of benefit, cost effectively. If we think of other kinds of energy sources, you'll probably think about the Middle East or other countries from which we import oil. The Middle East, by the way, is not where we get most of our oil. Now, it's not just a question of luck in which countries get the most natural resources and energy resources, but of course, there are political conditions that have set the stage for global inequality and continue to propagate and evolve as time and history continue. So these include colonialism, war, civil strife, corrupt governments, lack of infrastructure, which again might be connected to colonialism. Okay, now we're going to move on to discuss some historical periods in global geography, which is really necessary for understanding the origins of major world events. And I just want to point out a great figure, which is figure 1.11 in the 4th edition and figure 1.21 in the 5th edition, which gives an overview of the major periods of development throughout the globe. So first we'll talk about the early modern period, from about 1500 in the Common Era to about 1800 in the Common Era. So this was dominated by resource extraction and direct colonization of the Americas, Asia, and Africa by Europeans, again with the main focus of the colonization being the extraction of resources. And to give a quick textbook definition of colonialism, it is the establishment and maintenance of political and legal domination by a state over a separate and alien society. So here's a view from the textbook of the world in 1714. This shows the extent of European colonialism throughout the world. You'll notice that a lot of these gray areas while unclaimed by Europe, were of course highly populated at the time and had their own functioning societies and civilizations. And you can see that a lot of European colonialism at the time was focused in the Americas and in the Near East. The era of colonialism is typified by discovery and invasion, and driven by economic, political, and religious motives. There is a notion, of course, that European Western countries were superior and worthy of ruling the rest of the world, and in fact, perhaps even divinely called upon to rule the rest of the world. And this resulted in incredible flows of wealth from colonies to Western Europe, which is again important for setting the stage for the world economy as we know it today. Huge numbers of people were forcibly taken from Africa, mostly as labor, to help extract this value and bring it back to Europe. And as this process was going on, local systems, remember, in all of these gray areas, and including where colonies had already taken hold in 1714, local systems were being displaced, transformed, and local ways of living were being destroyed and forever changed. The next major historical period in global geography is the late modern period, starting around 1800 in the Common Era and continuing through the 1980s, basically up to the present, which we'll be covering in greater detail later on. So in this era, important developments include the rise of the nation-state, which is a way of saying the governing of a homogeneous group of people by their own state, and, most importantly, the establishment of capitalism as the dominant political economic project worldwide. And this led to European and then later on to US hegemony, with hegemony being another way of saying who's dominating the world, basically. For those of you who are interested, and of course it gets a lot more complicated than this, here's a textbook definition of capitalism. It is a form of economic and social organization characterized by the profit motive and the control of means of production, distribution, and exchange of goods by private ownership. And this is the primary economic, social, and political order that we face today that has developed for the past several centuries. First, in concert with colonialism, and then eclipsing it. So here's the world as it was divided up essentially by the European powers and independent powers in 1914, right before the First World War, which started a wave of independence movements. Now you'll see that in South America, in Latin America, a lot of former colonies had already declared their independence, but in Sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of Asia, colonialism was still alive and well. Now, post-World War II, the most significant historical period in global geography from 1945 to 1989 is the Cold War, which pitted basically two political economic projects, capitalism and communism/socialism, although they are not the same thing, of course, against one another. So here in blue, we've got the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and Western aligned nations. And in red, because of seemingly in every map, communist countries always have to be red, right? We've got the USSR and its satellite states and USSR aligned nations. And then we have this third group, this non-aligned group, who have remained important until this day. Now, even though the Cold War is over, the non-aligned movement, which formed then, still meets to this day and discusses basically issues of importance to them. Now, you'll notice that most of these countries are what might be called poorer, underdeveloped, or developing nations. And so they're cooperating, trying to pool their resources and advocate for global policies that will help them develop. And from 1980 to the present, we have the post-industrial era. This is defined by an increasing international division of labor. So, for instance, that means a lot of manufacturing moving from the United States and Europe to other world regions, so especially Mexico, China, and India, and Southeast Asia. And also conflict along the lines of ethnicity, religion, and other social differences. Now here we have the percentage of GDP as it's been distributed among world regions for the past 500 years. And we can see from this that the share of GDP does not remain constant over time. What might jump out at you here is the arrival of the United States on the global scene. And we can see here, especially peaking right after World War II, the United States becoming a major economic power in the world. And what we see since 1980 is the share of global GDP spreading somewhat to other countries, most notably China. Now, GDP is not the only way of comparing different countries and comparing development of different countries. The Human Development Index was developed by the United Nations, and basically it's a composite statistic that includes health factors, education factors, and living factors. So taking all of these into account, it assigns an HDI number to each country. This map shows in blue the so-called most highly developed nations, while in this light shade of green we have countries that have the lowest score in the Human Development Index. And you'll see that there are a lot of similarities with the distribution of GDP, but not complete overlap. So this measurement gives us another tool for understanding the unevenness of the distribution of well-being and wealth throughout the world. And let me draw your attention once again to South and Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, which again, using this composite score of health, education, and living standards, have some of the lowest scores on the Human Development Index. There are some more creative ways of thinking about comparing countries to one another and measuring how well they're doing. So one of these alternative measures is the Gross National Happiness Index, proposed by the government of Bhutan, although it has since fallen out of favor. But the Gross National Happiness Index, kind of a planned gross national product, would instead look more at social and psychological well-being as opposed to economic indicators. So looking at social and spiritual attainment as opposed to material attainment. When we're thinking about the unevenness of development and wealth throughout the world, there are some broad trends that are worth noting. You may have heard before the phrases global north and global south. This is referring to the global north, which, while Australia is in the southern hemisphere, it gets included in this measurement. But looking at this map, you can see that mostly the most developed countries in the world are concentrated in the northern hemisphere, especially North America and Western Europe, while the less developed countries are focused in the global south. Now, in terms of population, this is most of the world. Now, a number of theories have emerged to explain the unevenness of the distribution of wealth and development throughout the world. Before we move on to discuss a few of them, I want to stop and put in a quick plug for a more advanced course offered by the Department of Geography specifically on theories of development. So if you're interested, it's a great course. I highly encourage you to look into it and to take it. The first theory of development that we'll discuss today is modernization theory, which was proposed by Walt Rostow in the 1960s. It's a very, very linear way of looking at development, which basically states that it's only a matter of time before low-income societies catch up to everyone else. Rostow predicts that societies will progress along this prescriptive linear path from traditional society all the way to fully developed countries. Now, economists in developing countries looked at this and said, hey, that's not what's going on. So an alternative put forward by ECLAC, which is the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and of course other scholars throughout the world, says that economic progress of the peripheral or less developed countries is being constrained by the economic and political power of already developed affluent core countries, dividing the world into core, semi-periphery, and periphery. This is very similar to world systems theory. So to discuss for a moment the processes that these development theories are trying to describe, at a very basic level, it's talking about an international division of economic labor, where the periphery is focused on extraction of raw materials, which are then taken to the global core, manufactured, which is of course the most lucrative process, the most lucrative part of the process, right? Would you rather be an exporter of wood, or would you rather be a furniture store? And then shipped as finished goods back to peripheral and semi-peripheral countries. And so these theories argue that this international division of labor is keeping peripheral countries down and underlining the already existing structural inequalities in the world. This brings us to neoliberal development theory. Now, I'm guessing that neoliberalism is a term that you've heard before. In the development sphere, what it's referring to is a set of policies which started in the 1970s and are still prevalent today, adopted by international development. These include the opening up of free markets, deregulation, and decreased spending on social programs. Moving on to another term that you've probably heard before, it's time to think about the concept of globalization. In terms of a textbook definition, globalization includes the increasing interconnectedness, socially, culturally, economically, and politically, of the world's regions. Some key factors contributing to globalization include transnational corporations. Now, these include LLCs, limited liability corporations, and the fact that these corporations are spanning national boundaries. They exercise a large amount of influence and power over peripheral states, where basically they might contribute a very high percentage of that country's gross domestic product. And so it behooves the policymakers to be friendly with them. And as a result of globalization and falling barriers to international trade, this has led to a lot of jobs going to cheaper labor markets. So remember earlier we were talking about the inputs necessary for economic activity being spread unevenly throughout the world. So on one hand you have energy resources, and then you have labor. Now labor does not cost the same throughout the world. And under globalization, it's made it easier for transnational corporations to shift their labor, especially in manufacturing, from the global north, the United States and Western Europe, to developing nations in the global south. This has led to a new international division of labor, which has seen a decline of the United States as an industrial producer, the decentralization of manufacturing and production globally, and specializations within the core, especially with industries such as finance, so-called quaternary industries, so finance, research, things like that. The internationalization of finance means that banking and financial markets have taken a global turn. And in any world city, you can find headquarters of international corporations, stock exchanges, banks, and the free flow of money and goods. Additional factors in globalization include new technologies, so less expensive energy sources for manufacturing, more efficient and less expensive manufacturing and management technologies. Here's a huge one, communications. So that means the internet, satellites, and cheap transportation of goods from one market to another. So with advancements in communication, it's very easy to manufacture goods in one country, design them in another, sell them in entirely another country, because it's easy to get the designs and then the products themselves back and forth. And this has led to the homogenization of consumer markets throughout the world. So if you've traveled around the world, there are certain brands that you'll see everywhere. Coca-Cola, Starbucks. But there are a lot more brands that, although you might not recognize them, are owned by some of the same companies throughout the world. It could be a very disconcerting process to go to a Walmart in China and buy products that you recognize from a Walmart in the United States. The ironic part being that, of course, they were actually manufactured in that country. Another key factor in globalization is the movement of people within and between countries. So a huge part of this is urbanization. The global share of people living in cities is past 50%. Most humans are living in cities. That happened, I believe, in 2007. In the United States, it's 80%. In addition, people are moving between countries for the purpose of, one, following the work where it is, and two, sending money back home, which is still very difficult if you're a laborer, but easier than it has been before, and a survival strategy for many families. But there's a very dark side to this. For instance, labor practices in some parts of the world are unrecognizable, at least when it comes to what we're used to in the United States. In Qatar, the country with the highest GDP per capita in the world, laborers, especially from South Asia, are being brought in and exploited to build the World Cup stadiums. A lot of these workers are being killed because they're working in very, very unsafe conditions. And the bureaucratic means of how they're brought into the country, their employers get to hold on to their visas. Their lives are completely controlled by their employers. They don't get paid very well, and they have very little choice as to when and whether they can go home. This map shows an example of flows of labor and people in just one sub-region of the world, but it gives you an idea of the massive scale of human migration being brought on by globalization. Now, a lot of people think that this is going great. You've probably heard of Thomas Friedman. He's a columnist for the New York Times. And in his books, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, and more recently, The World is Flat, he's basically a cheerleader for globalization. He and his compatriots would argue that globalization is a logical expression of capitalism, which will ultimately benefit all nations by increasing wealth. The argument about a rising sea raising all ships. Or the argument that wealth will trickle down from core countries to periphery countries, although Thomas Friedman wouldn't necessarily use those terms. They argue that every country and every region should seek its own economic niche. In other words, what is that country best at doing? It should do that and get really good at it, and then use it as a stepping stone for further development. And that this will be aided by the free flow of capital and global economic wealth between countries. And ultimately, they think this will lead to an economic convergence, wherein the world's poorer countries will be able to catch up to the world's wealthier countries. And this idea has the strong support of multinational organizations, especially, as I mentioned before, the IMF and the World Bank. So they're encouraging less developed countries to adopt these policies with the hope that it will ultimately lead to economic convergence. On the other hand, a critique of globalization would hold that it's not at all a natural process. It's an economic process which is being promoted and dictated by core countries. Looking at the data, critics of globalization argue that, in fact, it's creating greater inequalities between the rich and poor globally. So even if GDP is increasing in some less developed countries, most of the increase in GDP is being experienced by a very small share of that population, while the gap between that small share of the population and everyone else is getting larger and larger. Further critiques are that globalization promotes free market, export-oriented economies at the expense of localized sustainable activities. So what does this look like? This means that if we go to the Andes, where there is a lot of quinoa and asparagus being grown, instead of subsistence crops that could feed people who live right there, there are export-oriented crops that are being grown because quinoa has gone health crazy in the United States. Now, of course, it's delicious and we like to eat it, but it's an example of export-oriented economies that are hurting local sustainable livelihoods. Critics of globalization would furthermore argue that the free market economic model is not the one that today's developed countries used for their own development. And they would point to the history of colonialism and the development of capitalism to say that this path that is being proposed first of all, is not actually available to developing countries, and second of all, isn't the one that was actually followed by currently developed countries. And finally, they point to the recurring financial crises. For instance, you'll remember the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which started in the United States but spread throughout the world. And you might also think about the current difficulties with China's slowing growth and the economic ripples that's having throughout the world, including in Western markets. Looking at the consequences of globalization, the actual effects on the ground, you might say, we've seen an exacerbation of environmental and social problems. So this includes when transnational firms disrupt local economies and ecosystems in their search for natural resources and manufacturing sites. For instance, as part of the North American Free Trade Agreement, U.S. corporations in Mexico aren't subject to Mexican jurisdiction when it comes to environmental issues. As I mentioned before, this is also leading to an increase in the number of people moving between countries. And along with that, there are opportunities for those people to be taken advantage of, and of course for criminal elements of globalization. Global trade in drugs, global trade in humans, especially in the sex trade, and terrorism. And I mentioned earlier the homogenization of consumerism. There's also a globalization of culture. So culture defined by our textbook as a range of activities that characterize a particular group. Well, wherever you go in the world, at least in large cities, this is coming to resemble more and more one global culture. And I'd just like to end with a balanced approach to globalization. These two tables that look at some of the positive aspects and also some of the negative aspects of globalization. So in the plus column, there are arguments that it's providing growing competition, more specialization in markets, more efficient division of labor internationally, and that this is leading to innovation and cheaper production. So this is why you can get a quality, inexpensive television that was made in China. With a global market, this pushes prices down and overall increases economic growth. Technology can spread throughout the world. Hopefully, that would be perhaps clean energy technology. And then finally, proponents of globalization would argue that because companies are only willing to invest in a somewhat transparent system, this will lead to greater democratization throughout the world. And once again, to provide a synopsis of some of the negative aspects of globalization, critics would say that gains are mostly going to rich nations, individuals, and regions. So even when gains are going to less developed countries, within those countries, it's rich individuals who are benefiting most. Poor regions become further marginalized. Polarization leads to increasing conflicts over resources and along social and ethnic lines. Increasing interdependencies create fragility in the global market. So again, as I mentioned, crises have a tendency, especially when they're in major economies like the US, Western Europe, or China, to spread and become global crises. National sovereignty is being threatened and undermined by the rise of transnational corporations. And again, to put this in explicit terms, when you think about it, the value of certain transnational corporations is much higher than the GDP of the countries in which they operate. And finally, that this is leading to increased unemployment in the global north, especially in manufacturing sectors. And as we're sitting here in Ohio, or you may be watching this anywhere in the world, at least our university is headquartered in Ohio, and I'm sitting in Columbus as we speak. This is a state that has lost a lot of manufacturing jobs, especially from the auto industry, to globalization. So, again, for more details, please review the textbook. and the other materials posted on the website. And thank you once again for listening.